Now, instead of sending the U.S. government a check, it sends the U.S. government a bill. That's one of the reasons that the deficits are going to explode. Not only because it's costing the government so much more interest on its massive $32 trillion national debt.
In today's video, Peter Schiff, founder, CEO and global strategist of Euro-Pacific Capital, gives a warning that the 2008 crisis was just the prelude to a larger sovereign debt crisis in the United States that may lead to a collapse of the US dollar.
One of the senators asked Powell about the losses on the Fed's balance sheet because he correctly pointed out, the problem with Silicon Valley Bank or Signature Bank, these other banks, is that the value of their treasuries went down, right? The value of their mortgage-backed securities went down, and so that's why they were insolvent. And he said, what about the Fed? The Fed's got the biggest balance sheet of all, and the Fed has massive losses too on its bonds. And so he said, what about that? And Powell basically shrugged it off and said, well, it's just a paper loss. It doesn't matter. Well, it does matter. It matters a lot because it matters to the solvency of the bank, because if the Fed actually had to shrink its balance sheet faster to fight inflation, it would have to sell those bonds and realize those paper losses. Now, the other point that Powell made that was completely ignored, he pointed out that, when we were running a profit, when we were collecting all this interest on our balance sheet, we were sending that money along to Congress. So, we weren't making a profit. We were sending all the profit to Congress, which is true. But then he stopped the discussion and nobody followed up to point out that now the Fed is sending a bill. Because here's what's happening to the Fed. They're earning a very low rate on their portfolio because they have a lot of these low yielding bonds that they bought, but they're paying 5%, for their overnight deposits. So the Fed used to make a lot of money because it was paying nothing on the overnight deposits. It was collecting 50, 100, 150, 200 basis points on its massive portfolio of treasuries. And then it was giving that money back to the Congress, and it had extra money. So that made the deficits, which were enormous anyway, but it made them less enormous because they got this extra windfall. Well, now the same Fed is paying 5% on its deposits, collecting 50, 100, 150 basis points. It's losing more money now than it used to make. But now instead of sending the U.S. government a check, it sends the U.S. government a bill. That's one of the reasons that the deficits are going to explode. Not only because it's costing the government so much more interest on its massive $32 trillion national debt, but because now instead of getting several $100 million a year from the Fed in checks, it's getting several $100,000 billion a year rather from the Fed in bills. So everything is exploding to the upside, which is why I said on my last podcast that the deficit is going to rise so much in the final year and a half of Biden's term that he is going to beat Donald Trump's record for the most debt in a single term. And the irony of it is, or whoever gets the next term after Biden will probably break that record because this thing is just exploding. It is on autopilot by the very nature of the problem. And the bigger the deficits get, the more pressure there is on the deficits to grow. Now, there was a big discussion on the effect that deficit spending would have on the economy. And this was with a Republican, again, trying to corner Powell into an admission that deficit spending is the root source of inflation. But Powell didn't want to admit that. But what he did say is he said, well, yes, if you get an increase in government spending, that will stimulate the economy. And so that will cause some more demand, which on the margin could lead to slightly more inflation, right? He didn't want to, he kind of reluctantly admitted that. But what Powell got wrong is what every Keynesian gets wrong. He thinks that when the government runs a deficit, it stimulates the economy. It doesn't stimulate the economy, right? Because stimulating the economy would be like a good thing, like, oh, the economy is more productive, right? No. All government deficit spending stimulates is spending, consumption. It doesn't stimulate the economy. It stimulates consumption, but the economy is production. That's the important part. So all you get when you stimulate consumption through increased government spending is inflation. That's what Powell doesn't understand. The difference between creating inflation and creating economic growth. Because when you talk about stimulating the economy, most people would think that, oh, it's stimulating economic growth. No, what stimulates economic growth is repealing regulations, is reducing government spending and reducing taxation to free up resources back into the private sector. That's what stimulates the economy. And also what stimulates the economy are the collective efforts of all the people who work in the private sector, of entrepreneurs coming up with new ideas, starting new businesses. What stimulates the economy is savings, underconsumption, capital investment. Nothing the government does by spending money stimulates anything other than inflation. That's all it does. And just like any other Keynesian, Powell still doesn't get that. All right, so I'm going through. I'm going through my tweets now where I tweeted out all this stuff from Greenspan and Volcker criticizing the Fed because, again, the senators were trying to get Powell to admit that government spending is causing inflation, and he wouldn't do it. And finally, I want to point out a comment that Senator Warren made at the very end of it, Elizabeth Warren. And she was really just taking Powell to task because of all this deregulation that he supposedly favored. And Warren is blaming all the problems that we have now in the banking system on the fact that Powell wanted to deregulate, that we just took away too much government regulation. And now we have this broken financial system. And Powell broke it through deregulation. And that's why she didn't approve of his reappointment, was because of all this deregulation that he was in favor of that has now wrecked the banking system. Well, the only thing that Elizabeth Warren got right is that the banking system is broken. She's right about that. But she is completely wrong about who broke it. She helped broke it. The government broke it. The Fed broke it. Not because it took regulations away, but because it put regulations there in the first place. It didn't take enough regulations away. It's like they can pass like a dozen regulations, and then maybe they roll back one or two. And then they say, aha, you see, look, you roll back these one or two regulations. That's what caused the problem. No, the problem was caused by the 10 regulations they didn't roll back. They left those in place. It is the government that screwed up the banking industry. It's one of the most highly regulated and subsidized industries in the country. That's why it's one of the most screwed up. The way you get a sound industry that doesn't have all kinds of imbalances, that doesn't have all kinds of excessive risk-taking, is to leave it alone, is to let the free market function. That is the best way. That is the only way to have a sound market, because that way people are responsible for the consequences of their own bad decisions. And that is the check that you need to balance everything out. Yes, people are greedy and they want to make money, but they also don't want to lose money. That's part of greed too, not wanting to lose money. And what the government does is they come in and they pass all these regulations to make people think it's impossible to lose money. They don't care about losing money. And that's what lets the greed run amok, because it's no longer checked by the fear. The free market provides both greed and fear. And there's a healthy balance because people are dealing with their own money. See, the problem with politicians is none of it is their own money. It's all somebody else's money. So they don't give a damn, right? They just care about their own reelection. They don't care about the real economic consequences. So what we need is to get rid of government. We need to get the government out of banking, and so we can get the free market back in